ragtag gangs of thugs from the desert to people who take and control territory and then create governments.
What did fighting with Americans look like?
So
Wait, what's the history there? I don't know how much we discussed that in episode 134 where we talked a lot about ISIS. Like, what was the history of ISIS specifically setting up shop in Syria?
Yeah. So, we've talked a lot in the past about Zarqawi and
Yes.
this sort of the rise of this, what was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Iraq. It was an Iraqi organization that really rose in opposition to the American occupation and in resistance to Shiite rulers in Iraq. Zarqawi, forms this movement, which becomes quite powerful and quite deadly. Eventually, he gets killed. His organization kind of goes to shit. By 2008, there's not much left of it. It's just kind of the leaders are on the run. And then, but they had their moment to kind of rebound when Arab Spring happened, and specifically when a civil war breaks out right next door in Syria. There are historic connections between the Syrian and Iraqi jihadist. Jolani, as we mentioned, was from Syria, but he had joined Zarqawi's group and had been part of that organization. And so they, Baghdadi saw an opportunity in Syria to create, had to build an army and to create a cause, and something that people, dedicated Islamists at least around the world would want to join and become part of. And because of the appeal of the fight against Assad and sort of the idea of creating a religious caliphate in Syria, that's what made ISIS so successful. So it hadn't been for Syria, we probably would not have heard of these guys.
And are you talking like kind of, I'm just doing math in my head, because like Zarqawi dies in 2006, Baghdadi comes out of prison, I think a couple years later. Are you talking like 09, 10, 11, 12-ish when they're really doing this in Syria?
Yeah, when they're really starting to come out.
All right, so this is something I always try to think about in my head, and I'm sure it's confusing for a lot of people at home because we just get stuck looking at a map with geography that says, oh, here's where borders are, and we're thinking about it, especially in America, we think about things so American-centrically, like, oh, that must mean they have towns right there, and there's a mayor, and whatever. But in reality, there's a lot of no man's land, and there's places where, the Kurds may control, who are the good guys in this case, or ISIS could come in and just be like, yo, we run this place right now. So when ISIS, particularly in those years I just mentioned, is forming in Syria, what does it look like? Are they just literally going to a town of, I don't know, 500 people and being like, this is ours now, and you're going to be under the ISIS flag and torturing anyone who doesn't join them? Or is it more subtle of a rise where they're trying to win hearts and minds at the beginning?
Yeah. In Syria, it was a case where they literally rolled in their vehicles and said, we're in charge. And they did that in the city of Raqqa, which is in eastern Syria. It ends up becoming their capital. And it's the place where we've seen most of the really horrific images of beheadings and crucifixions and, burning people alive. All the terrible things we remember seeing ISIS do happen in that place. And they, the thing is about ISIS is that because of its history in Iraq and because it had fought the Americans for so long and because it had a lot of weapons and military experience, they were able to come in with more military competency than just about anybody else on the battlefield. Except for the professional army troops, they were the best fighters around. And so when they roll in with their slick guns and their Toyota trucks with machine guns mounted in the back, nobody tried to oppose them. They were the strongest ones around, and they were able to quickly take control of an area and just kill people who didn't agree with them or tried to get in their way. And so that's how they took over big chunks of Syria and Iraq. And they had help. They had people who were Syrian, or who, in case of Iraq, people who had been part of the military and part of the government and the intelligence infrastructure, who decided to join in with these guys because they saw them as winners. And so you go from a place where these are ragtag gangs of thugs from the desert to people who take and control territory and then create governments.
What did fighting with Americans look like prior to 2013, 2014? Well, really 2014, when we all learned about ISIS because shit started going down in Iraq. Like, were we were doing operations directly military on ISIS in like 2009?
Yeah.
Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting in it really started almost in the beginning. So we, if we remember our history, 2003, early 2003 is when the invasion takes place. By late March, the United States has control of Iraq. The guy who became sort of the seminal character in the ISIS story, Zarqawi, had moved himself to Iraq with the intention of creating this army to fight the great Satan, to fight the Americans.
Yes.
So he was in place. He built this sort of army around him, including a lot of disaffected Iraqis who didn't have jobs anymore, who used to be part of the army or the intelligence services, and they joined with him, and they became they sort of embraced this model of sort of spectacular terrorist attacks. So they went after UN mission, NGOs who were in Iraq to try to rebuild the country, less against American soldiers per se, because he didn't want to fight us that directly. It was more about kind of, eroding the infrastructure that helped us maintain some order and some control over in Iraq in that early period. Eventually, though, the Americans came to see Zarqawi and this sort of nascent ISIS movement as a number one threat. And so we invested a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of intelligence firepower to just finding him and killing him and stopping his leaders. And so there's a period from about 2004 to 2006 when he was killed, and then for a couple of years afterward where there was this really high-paced, high-tempo, counter terrorist campaign that ended up, sweeping up a lot of these bad guys and their leadership.
Right, but to your point, this is when, like, Zarqawi, and that's what your book Black Flags, the Pulitzer-winning book, was about. It was about the history of him and how he formulated what became ISIS. But ISIS didn't take that name for years until Bakr Baghdadi.
Oh
yeah, Bakr Baghdadi took charge. But so 04 to 06, they're hunting out Zarqawi. He dies in 06. 06 to 08, the remnants of the people who were behind him, they're hunting and killing them. I guess maybe I thought about this wrong when I was reading all this stuff, but, like, does that mean that much of what they fought against 06 to 08 still existed, meaning it wasn't just a few people who got the idea to stay alive and then Baghdadi comes in and really grows it, versus, like, none of them existed and a whole new organization formed?
So there's a little bit of both, and there's some truth to that for sure, in that we dismantled. We kicked the shit out of them, and that was kind of our objective, and we were good at that. But what also happened was wherever Zarqawi and his followers did succeed in having territorial control over villages and towns, they wore out their welcome really quickly, because nobody wants to live in a caliphate, as it turns out. It's a really shitty place to live. So they kind of eroded their own popular support. They became very unpopular in Iraq, except, among their core supporters. And we just demolished them. We dismantled their infrastructure until there wasn't much left by 2008, 2009.
So the embers of that, though, rise their own phoenix with Baghdadi. And so they're new. Basically what I'm getting at is the people who were now fighting American forces, which is where I started this tangent, in, say, 09, 2010, 2011 Syria, these are mostly people who were not at all involved during that last time.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
So they are, like, we're engaging in my book, I know it's not, but, like, officially, but in my book, it's almost like we're engaging a new phenomenon at that point, because the players have all changed. It's like if you played against the Philadelphia Phillies today, you're not playing against the 2008 Philadelphia Phillies. All those guys are retired. It's a brand new team. They have the same name. They play in the same place. Similar type idea here, but it's a new team, totally different organization era. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Different, even ethnic and tribal makeup. So that all
Really?
that sort of changes because it becomes more Syria focused. And so you see, and the other thing, which is Zarqawi would never have dreamed of having this mass migration of people from around the world to join. So there's all these North Africans, and there are people from Chechnya, from the Caucasus, who come in to join this thing. So it becomes this kind of very vibrant, diverse group of people who have one thing in common, which they're all extremists. They all have this very harsh, hardline view of their religion and of the world, and we're right, everybody else is wrong, and we're ordained by God to create this special project called the Caliphate, and nobody's going to stop us.
Minus the rough and rugged nature of them taking over by force land in Syria in 08, 09, 10, 11, and all that. What made Syria ripe for having especially young males who would want to join that at the time?
Yeah. Well, some of it is just, if you're on the winning team, if your Philadelphia Eagles are kicking ass every week,
Damn right.
so that attracts a certain profile to start with, and we have in Syria, you have a huge percentage of the population that really hates Assad, that thinks Assad is a brutal dictator, which he was, and that he tortured and killed innocents, and he should go. And if you're looking to fight him and you're looking to push them out of power, well, if you're going to hitch your wagon to one of these groups, here's one that's successful. Oh, and by the way, here's one that has the best weapons. It pays well. It pays better salaries.
Oh, they were paying well.
They're paying well. And they could do that because the places that they took over, in Raqqa, for example, first stop is at the local bank where they just take all the currency out. And they've operated this way across Iraq and Syria in places they control, just kind of hoovered out all the hard currency, all the euros and dollars, and became fabulously wealthy overnight. And if you got that kind of a bankroll, you can afford to pay your fighters very well. And that buys a certain kind of loyalty.
Where were the Kurds in like 09, 10, 11 while ISIS was muscling into the southern area? Because my understanding is that the Kurds, I don't know if we can pull up a map, Alessi, so maybe Joby can point out exactly where, but they have a lot of territory, especially on like the southeastern front of Syria. Is that right?
That's right. And it's one of these major groups, one of the few in the world that have no homeland. The Kurds, kind of their population is divided among several countries, Syria just being one. There's a lot in there. Turkey, there are Kurdish, big Kurdish areas in Iraq. And they had been, among the many groups that had been beaten down by Assad over the years and beaten down by the Turks as well, because the Turks saw them as a threat. There was this group called the PKK, which is one of the major sort of terrorist groups that carry out attacks in Turkey just in the name of Kurdish independence. And so had been marginalized. ISIS takes over and systematically starts killing a lot of them. And so you see these huge battles that take place in northern, sort of extreme northeastern Syria, towns like Manbij and Kobani and other places where Americans ended up getting eventually involved. And there was this moment where the U.S. administration, this is in getting my timing wrong, 2013, 14, decided to intervene, at least with humanitarian assets, to try to keep these people from being slaughtered, the Yazidis particularly, but also Kurds. And so that was the first moment when the United States enters into this war against ISIS. And eventually we end up sort of backing Kurdish militias who become, competent enough and well-armed enough that they can take on ISIS. Like
Peshmerga?
Exactly. Yeah. But they're pretty good anyway, but they just didn't have the sort of funding, the backing, and the kind of weapons that we could give them. And eventually, the story of the destruction of ISIS, it happens mostly because Americans backing groups like Peshmerga, who became the frontline soldiers who went from town to town and village to village and pushed the ISIS folks out and mostly killed them. But they went from being sort of the victims in all this, the sort of the downtrodden and the ones who were getting punched around, to having a pretty capable militia with Uncle Sam backing them.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here